going on now. Get huge holiday savings at your local Ashley store. Buy one, get one, half off everything. That's right. Buy anything in our showroom and get anything of equal or lesser value half off. Living rooms, bedrooms, mattresses, dining rooms, recliners, table sets, everything is included. Buy a bedroom, get the mattress half off. Buy a sofa, get the love seat half off. Buy a living room, get a dining room for half off. Buy a third item, get the fourth item half off. The savings never end, but buy one, get one half off is for a limited time only. Shop all of our deals in store, only at Ashley.
Hi, I'm Kire Godal, and I'm a filmmaker in Africa.
Hello, I'm Chris Stafford, and this is Art, the podcast where we get to know women from around the world of visual arts. This is Season 2, Episode 14. My guest this week is the filmmaker Kire Godal, whose focus on African culture and wildlife has reached audiences through National Geographic, the Discovery Channel, BBC, Amazon Prime, among others. Her purpose and goal is to capture and memorialise important stories that she feels need to be recorded for history and to educate a wider public, at a time when both people and animals are under threat of radical social and environmental changes or extinction. Kire was born in Aspen, Colorado in 1962, one of 3 children, she has 2 brothers, to Norwegian immigrants Inga and Bente Godal. Her childhood was spent exploring the backcountry of Colorado, riding and skiing. She soon developed a passion for the outdoors and animals, which drew her to ambitions of being an explorer. But first, after high school, she was going to find herself in the Big Apple, drawn to the world of modelling after being talent spotted on the slopes by the American modelling agency executive Eileen Ford. Whilst on fashion shoots and the catwalks of New York, Kire became fascinated in the art of photography and was soon drawn to being behind the camera. It was also at this time that Kire met her first husband, the Italian model agent Giorgio Pagliazzi, who would take her in a new direction. Kire found herself living in Anguilla, BWI, and Caracas, Venezuela, while raising her first 2 children, before returning to the US. She had decided by now that she wanted a career in filmmaking, and took herself back to school at UCLA to study broadcast journalism. From there, she worked in TV news, but it was the draw of the wild that led her to Kenya, where she met her second husband and started her own production company, Malacca Media, as an independent filmmaker while raising 3 children, but by now as a single parent. Her dreams and ambitions led to her making her own self-funded films, which gradually led to bigger and more ambitious productions. Her portfolio includes Maasai, The Last Dance of the Warriors for National Geographic, Lion Warriors for National Geographic Wild, Sky Paths, and many more ethnographic and natural history wildlife productions. Kire lives in Kenya and is currently working on 2 productions, Tolstoy the Tomato Thief, about a super tusker elephant, and Masai Unoto, featuring the important Masai warrior passage to elderhood ceremony. Kire, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for taking time, because I know you're in the middle of 2 productions right now and on a very busy schedule, so thank you for taking the time to do this.
You're welcome. It's great to be here, Chris. Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad I discovered you and what you're doing. And I have to say, also, I'm leaning towards making Tolstoy my screensaver. We should explain, not Tolstoy the author, but Tolstoy the elephant to the tomato thief.
That's right. And Tolstoy is the feature film that I'm working on right now. And he is a super tusker elephant from the Amboseli area in Kenya, the base of Kilimanjaro. And he was named Tolstoy by Cynthia Moss and her group of researchers, because they've been studying the tea family since the 1970s. And every every baby born of a T female has to have a T name. And they were running out of names, as they're always searching for names. And Tolstoy is the name they chose for him. So he has this wonderful name for an African elephant.
And he really is absolutely fabulous. I'm going to put a link in the show notes, and we'll talk more about it later as well, Kire, because he's one of two productions that you're currently working on right now, Tolstoy, the Tomato Thief. Let's talk a little bit more about this background, this history you have with Kenya, this affiliation to Kenya, because most people, when they think of Kenya, they think of the Masai Mara. And of course, there's epic images and memories that they might have through visiting, but you have immersed yourself completely in that culture, in the wildlife, and filming it from a very in-depth perspective, not as a visitor, but someone who is passionate about the history, the culture of that area. So tell me why, first of all, before we rewind the clock back to where it all began, but tell me, what was it in particular that captured your imagination and made you so devoted and dedicated your career to that area?
I think since I was a very small child, I mean, I know since I was at least 5 years old in my first memories, that African wildlife was the thing I cared about the most. And in fact, I used to collect stuffed animals, and they were always African species. And all my life, although I went through different paths, I always knew that I would end up in Africa. And it was kind of a calling from very early on. And I was, it was a delayed kind of career for me. I didn't even get started into my 30s in Africa, but I had the lucky chance of going on a trip with a girlfriend and working in Africa as a journalist. And when I landed in the airport and I walked out of the plane and I smelled the air there, I knew it. I was like, it struck me so deeply. And I thought, this is it. I'm home. This is where I need to be. And this is where I'm going to come back. And I did, moving myself to Africa with my 2 children then, and decided to embark on a career that I knew if I had gone a different path in life, I would have ended up retiring in Africa, because it was the thing I wanted to do more than anything else. So I decided to cut the chase, do it early, and start my own business there and start making films. And it's been a lifelong dream for me.
So obviously the sights, the smells, the culture, the people, but there must have been something that you truly connected with, your soul connected with, because it really has become a connection that, is part of your bloodstream now.
Yeah, it has. And I think it's a combination of everything. It's, first and foremost, it's the colors, it's the smell, it's the wilderness that still exists in a very pure form. The cities kind of butt right up against the wilderness areas. And it's the sense of adventure and of the unexpected. And that you're living a life that has a sense of reality where it's been kind of homogenized everywhere else. And with that comes this incredible beauty that has also not been completely discovered in a way visually. You're in a moment of capturing things that are slowly vanishing, and you're able to be part of this reality of you can't quite put your finger on it, but it's an ancient world with a pulse and a sense of liveliness and beauty that you don't find in most cities and most kind of first world places in the world, first world countries.
When we think of Africa and the wildlife, and getting as close as you do to film the magnificence and almost you can hear their heartbeat of these animals, you get so close to them. It makes me wonder, I know there's a certain amount of risk, but would you consider yourself a courageous woman, a brave woman?
Yeah, I think so. I know that I'm a bit of a risk taker in that sense, but I don't have a lot of fear. And that's something that my family has always commented on. They're always trying to pull me back a little bit. I don't feel afraid. And because of that, I can naturally move. I feel I can move into environments with a sense of calmness, and I can blend in. And because of that, I'm able to get close and I'm able to stay. And I'm not nervous. So I don't make a lot of sound and also just movements that frighten wildlife. And I think that's one of the biggest things is the way you move around animals.
Absolutely, yes. And filmmakers would say, and even a cinematographer would say that they want to be part of the scene, that they almost are part of the cast in a way when they're filming. They're hidden behind the camera, but they become a part of the scene and almost sort of disregarded, and hopefully people are not paying attention to them in a way that detracts from the scene. But I'm imagining that you were doing exactly that, but to a greater extent because you're dealing with wild animals.
Yeah. It's a gentleness. And you're right. And your whole goal is to be invisible. You really don't want to stand out. And in order to do that, your body and your energy adapts to where you are. And it becomes, if you're on foot, especially, and, I do a lot of handheld work, it's almost like a ballet. You become part of the ballet and your movements mirror the movements of the animals or the people that you're with. And it becomes this intuitive dance. And what you don't know, for instance, what's going to happen next, you can feel somehow, you sense it. And you just rely on your instincts to guide you, but in a way that doesn't draw attention.
Because often when you're working behind a camera, we can feel a boldness that we don't have without the camera. Do you feel that you get just so in the zone and immersed in that you may not be thinking about the risks that are involved?
Absolutely.
You are so into shooting those images and something could happen, but you are so absorbed and in the zone.
You're right. Absolutely right. And it happens all the time. And I have always two people with me when I'm filming. It's my sound man, who I've worked with for 25 years, who's not behind a camera, so he's watching the scene. And also my camera assistant, who is Maasai, and very intuitive. And often he's right behind my back and he kind of holds onto my T-shirt, as it were, and guides me forward or backwards so I don't stumble with the camera. And I can be completely absorbed in what's happening. And they will be the ones who will tap me on the shoulder and start to pull me back. And recently filming Tolstoy, in fact, we were in my car and I was filming out of my side of the driver's seat window. Tolstoy was so close to us and he was so available for a super tusker elephant who was very evasive and difficult to even get near or even get a shot of for months and months. Suddenly, there was a sense of acceptance and he would turn towards me and pivot his shoulders to me and open his ears and look at me. And oftentimes that means they might be assessing whether they're going to charge you. But I could tell by his breathing and the way he was acting that he was just curious and involved. And he was coming closer and closer. And I couldn't really sense the distance because I had the lens between me and him until I could hear my sound man behind me rolling up his window. And he was pulling in his boom because he was scared that Tolstoy was going to grab the boom. And there was a ranger in the car with me at the time, and he was saying in Maasai to my assistants, tell her, if she doesn't start the car right now and back up, I am opening the door and I'm running. And my camera assistant, Joel, tapped me on the shoulder and he said, get up. And I looked up and Tolstoy was, 2 meters away. And I just gently started the engine and rolled back about 6 meters, cut the engine, and waited, and he did it again. And he just calmly turned towards us and started coming towards us. And I did this again and again until I finally thought, okay, enough's enough. I'm going to leave him alone now. And I never knew what he really wanted, but the sound man later said, Mike, my sound man said, I had the feeling that it was almost like he wanted to hug us. He wanted reassurance because elephants are social creatures and he had been injured. And that's why we could get so close to him. And he was alone and he wasn't used to it. And it was almost like he was accepting the car as company. And elephants will greet each other when they see each other. They'll come up and they'll touch their trunks, or they'll nuzzle their heads or their ivory if they're males. And it's almost as if he was doing that with us. It was a form of contact, but we'll never know. He might have wanted to just turn our car over with his ivory, which he could have done so easily. And, that's the thing. You just don't know. But yes, it does happen a lot when you're behind the camera, that your sense of wanting to film is so much stronger than your sense of danger or fear.
Yeah, or self-preservation. That is very emotional, hearing that story, Kira. I'm wondering if that's how you feel when you pull away and you can absorb what you've just done, that you've gotten so close to a wild animal. Doesn't that touch you emotionally? I would imagine it does.
Going on now. Get huge holiday savings at your local Ashley store. Buy one, get one, half off everything. That's right. Buy anything in our showroom and get anything of equal or lesser value half off. Living rooms, bedrooms, mattresses, dining rooms, recliners, table sets, everything is included. Buy a bedroom, get the mattress half off. Buy a sofa, get the love seat half off. Buy a living room, get a dining room for half off. Buy a third item, get the fourth item half off. The savings never end, but buy one, get one half off is for a limited time only. Shop all of our deals in store, only at Ashley.
It's so emotional. I think that when I think about my life, it's one of the strongest and best memories I have. And it makes me cry. Being with an animal and being seen and accepted in a way, or even being thought of as maybe they're going to turn you over, either whatever it is that they're doing, that proximity and their full attention on you, and the energy that is created in that contact is something you can't even explain. But it's so beautiful that it becomes like one of the memories that you go back to over and over again.
You had me right there in that moment, Kira. Yeah, that was a teary moment, that was, hearing that story. Let's move on.
And I did film, my camera assistant did get a little bit of that on my iPhone. Luckily, he just grabbed my iPhone because he sits next to me and he, hands me lenses. And there's a bit of a clip of that. And it was extraordinary. Anyway.
Yeah. Moving on. Well, we're going to move back because we're talking about our love of animals. Let's go back to where that all started, Kira. You were born in Colorado, and that is really the big country which first it was the first connection to wildlife for you, through horses, through riding, but also to getting out on the range, so to speak. What do you remember of the feelings that you had as a child when it came to the big country and the animals that you could connect with as a child?
I always knew that animals were for me. I never wanted dolls when I was growing up. I never wanted to dress up and play Barbie. I was much more interested in the animals and being outside, whether it was with my stuffed animals or with real animals like dogs and cats and squirrels that I used to rescue. And then, of course, horses came along. And I think I was very fortunate to be in Colorado at that time when, Aspen was just a small mountain town. It wasn't the Aspen of today, and it was a place of great freedom. Our parents were extremely, they let us have our independence. So from a very early age, we were outside from morning to night, and it was the wilderness or the forest or the mountains or the meadows really was my home. It was like my living room. It was the place I went to be inspired and be happy. And that's where I would rather be. The big sky, the mountains, the smells, the nature, everything about it was a childhood of being fully immersed and alive with the colors and the sounds. And you were living in a kind of world of almost poetry all the time. Winter, summer, seasons would change, and it would be a different landscape.
And what would we see if we went through the family photo album? What would the images be? Inge and Dente, your parents, your father's no longer with us, but tell us a little bit about the family and what those family images would look like if you were to go through your album now.
Both my parents are Norwegian, and they both lived through World War II. And so when it came time for them to go to university, they both chose to go to America, which was the promised land. It was a place of blue jeans and T-shirts and convertibles. And after World War II, it was heaven to them. They both were accepted into schools in America. And my father was in medical school. My mother went to a school in the East Coast, and she was training for, children's counseling. And she was scooped up by Stein Eriksen, the ski racer, and involved in the first ski schools and the first ski racing in America. My father left his medical school to become a full-time jazz musician, as Brubeck did, actually. And he was a fantastic musician. So they ended up meeting in Aspen, of all places. My mom was there starting a ski school and at Aspen Highlands, and my father was there playing with all the great jazz greats who were coming through at the Red Onion. And they fell in love at first sight, two Norwegians, and had no idea, they didn't know each other in Norway, met in America, got married in 3 months and started a family. And we grew up as a first generation Norwegian family in the mountains. So our lives were still very European, in a sense that, our home was very kind of around the arts. My mother always had classical music playing or jazz. We weren't allowed to listen to anything else at home. There was always flowers on the table. There was always a fire in the fireplace or candles burning. There was always a sense of beauty at home and talking to each other, drawing and playing together. And then on the weekends, we were outdoors. So our lives were very kind of wholesome in a lot of ways and revolved around the arts and the outdoors.
And what subjects were interesting you at school when you were younger?
I think, I was kind of dyslexic as a child, and I wasn't a great student at all. I mean, I struggled, but I was always one of the top people in art in school. I was always the one who could create and make things visually. So they would come to me to make the posters and make the classroom. I was always the one elected. That was always my strong area, that and creative writing. But I fell in love with the sciences as well and natural history. And I, studying birds and species in far off places became a kind of side passion for me. So that was really the things I kind of loved and did well in.
Did your parents guide you in some way towards any particular subjects, or did they leave your mind alone?
They left us be, they kind of let us be, but my mom was always handing me, pads of paper and pencils. That was always, she always kind of encouraged it. And we were always encouraged to play instruments, and music was a big thing in our family. And my older brother became a wonderful musician and composer, and I kind of was left with the drawing, and my younger brother became a kind of a visual arts person. So yeah, they were very, at that time, I think parents didn't hover over their children. We weren't kind of, it wasn't as if we had to fulfill their expectations. We were allowed to dream and encouraged, but it was up to us to figure out what we wanted.
Were you musical at all?
I think I was, but my older brother was so strong in music that, he kind of led the way and used to compose when he was 10 years old in classical music, and he was amazing. And so, yeah, and I was more visual. I'm not as audio as some people are. I learn by what I see, and I can look at something and I can see the negative space and the positive space. I can see a frame at anything I look at. And I'm framing things all the time. If I'm driving and I'm bored or sitting in a passenger seat, even as a child, I would be noticing the light on a hill and I would be framing it in my mind's eye. So for me, it was much more about the visual arts.
What was your relationship like with your parents? Was there anything that you inherited from their many traits that you felt that, you look back and think, well, I'm so glad that they influenced me in that way?
I think my mom was amazing, and she still is. We're very close. She was very encouraging, and she never told us that we couldn't do anything. It was always very positive, and she herself was very creative. So she encouraged that in us more than the academics. And I think because of that, I felt very comfortable not being, such an academic child, but being much more of a creative child. And she used to take us on these massive hikes in the mountain, and we would sing and talk and play games. And she was very playful. I always think of my mom as Mary Poppins, and she was that kind of mom. It was always delightful, and our childhoods was very happy. My father was much more abstract. He didn't take he wasn't with us very often, but his standard of music and his abilities really made us all want to become as good as he was. And he was a quiet soul. He was kind of a big polar bear of a man. And he was not, he wasn't ever unkind. He was a very kind person. And I think that in itself really allowed us to grow up believing in ourselves.
And you left high school early, I believe, in Aspen. I'm wondering then, what did you have in mind of what life is going to look like if you were going to leave school early? Were you ambitious, confident?
I think I knew what I wanted to do. I mean, I remember sitting around the swimming pool with girlfriends and saying, what are you going to be when you grow up? What do you want to do? And one wanted to be a model and one wanted to be a school teacher. And they turned to me and said, what do you want to be? And I said, I want to be an explorer. And they're like, what? Why would you want to do that? And I said, no, I want to be an explorer. I always looked at National Geographic, and it was the thing that inspired me the most was the people behind the cameras. So I knew that's what I wanted to do. And then when I was about 16, and I was teaching skiing on the weekends, I was approached by several people, and they asked if they could take my picture. And I said, okay, and they did. And they said, we're going to take this to New York. We think we want to show this to some of the fashion agency, the modeling agency. So I forgot all about it. But suddenly I got these phone calls, and my mother did, because, I gave my mom, of course, had to give permission. And I was basically discovered by Eileen Ford and Johnny Casablancas of Elite Agency at the time. And they were looking for models. And Eileen, my mom, of course, immediately said no. And then Eileen Ford came to Colorado for Christmas to ski, and we met her, and she promised my mother that she would look after me. And my mom at the time said, she left it to me. She said, look, I left home early and I went on my adventure in life. Kira, what do you want to do? And I thought, well, if I don't do this now, I'm probably not going to be able to do it later. These things come along. It's like being asked to play soccer on a great team or be part of something that might not ever happen again. And I said, and I wasn't a great student at school, and I was a very shy girl. And I was very mature for my age, and I wanted to go. So my mom let me. And at 16, I went to New York City and I lived with Eileen Ford in her house. And from there, I started modeling. And I never wanted to be a model. And that was the irony of it all. It wasn't something I chose to do, but it was something that happened, and it was exciting and adventurous, and I was intrigued by it. And so I ended up staying in New York and modeling and kind of self-educating at that time. And I was living with other models, and I was traveling back and forth home and teaching myself a lot about art and painting. And I spent a lot of time in museums on my free time. And if it wasn't the art museum, it was the Natural History Museum, where I would stand in front of in the African Hall of African Animals, a Hall of African Animals. I would stand in front of the dioramas, and I would lose myself in these amazing spaces in Africa, these horizons that never ended, and these animals that were just so powerful and big and beautiful and free. And I knew someday that's where I was going to go. So back to the modeling, I was in the world of the fashion world. It was hard to return home and go back to school after that, as you can imagine. I'd been exposed to so much. And I ended up meeting and marrying at a very early age my modeling agent from Italy, who was a very exciting and flamboyant man. So I kind of took a sideways track in my very young life, and, married when I was 20 years old. And it was through him that I eventually went back behind the camera.
What did modeling teach you? What were your takeaways from that?
Modeling was, I found it rather uninteresting, being a model, I have to say, but what I was fascinated in was what the images looked like when we were done. And I was always really interested in what the photographers were doing. And when I was married to Giorgio, and he, being Italian, I was exposed to a lot of the European fashion photographers, and watching what they did and seeing how they framed, and their eye and their aesthetics really inspired me. And I actually asked for a camera, and I started shooting photography myself. And I learned basically from them. There's another level of aesthetics that comes out, I think, especially in Europe. There's a sense of light and beauty and surprising contrasts that, that really kind of shocked me and inspired me. And it was that brought me to the next phase, where I decided I needed to be behind the camera.
Were you playing with a camera as a child, taking snapshots then at all? Was that a period that piqued your interest when you were younger, or this, as you just explained, was the turning point?
My mom had a camera. She had a box Brownie, and she was always taking pictures of us. And she was a fantastic photographer, really instinctual. And I loved what she did. But, because cameras weren't that common and film was rather expensive to buy and expose, I really didn't have a camera until, into my early 20s. But I watched my mother do it for years, and I knew my great-grandmother in Norway was, I believe, the first female photographer in Norway, if not one of the first. And she documented a lot of the fjords and the people living in the fjords that were very remote in the late 1800s. So there was always this connection to photography.
What was your first camera?
I had a Nikon F2 that I loved. I wish I still had it.
But there was a transition from still images to making film.
Yeah.
At that point, you were just telling us, talk us through those first steps of when you realized that you actually wanted to make a living out of this and how you went about it.
So I was then married and we traveled a lot, and we were living in Anguilla in the Caribbean, and we were also then living in Venezuela, and we spent quite a lot of time down on the border of Brazil in the jungles. And I had this sensation of wanting to go back to my original dream, which was, National Geographic exploration and being behind the camera. And I knew that's what I wanted to do, but I also knew that I needed to learn. And at the time, I basically said to my husband, Giorgio Piazzi, that I wanted to go back to school now and I wanted to get a degree. And he wasn't so keen on the idea. He was like, no, but you're my wife. You can do what you want. You don't need to. And I said, no, I have to. And it ended up in us separating. And I went back to the States and I went to California where my mom was with then my two small children. And I decided that I was going to study photojournalism. But what really turned me on was the filming side of it and documentary film. And that's what I eventually leaned towards. So I went to school and I studied journalism and I studied broadcast journalism and I started working in TV news as a reporter. And in that world, I realized that I really loved it. And I really loved the journalism side, and I love the reporting side, and I love the filming side, but I wanted to do long form, and I wanted to do it on subjects that I chose. And that's, when I basically was able to leave the States and go to Kenya and start a business and start working at making my own films.
Well, that sounds as if those steps were easy, but I'm sure they weren't. You had to have the resources to do that and connections as well. What were they? What enabled you to join those dots up seamlessly, it seems, and make a career and a business in Kenya?
Well, it certainly wasn't seamless at all. It was very difficult. And I was a single mom. And luckily my mother was amazing and she took care of the kids while I worked and studied and interned. And I think my sense of determination was so strong that I knew what I wanted to do. And I really had to make a lot of choices, personal choices about my life at the time. And it meant that I had to give certain things up. In order to achieve, I had to give up a lot of my personal life. There wasn't a lot of fun in my life. I spent a lot of time dedicated to, raising my kids and being with them and studying and working and making, paving this pathway. I got extremely lucky with one of my best friends whose mother was living in Kenya, and she had won a raffle ticket at a fundraiser for a trip for two to Kenya. And her boyfriend at the time, who was a New Yorker, was like, I don't like bugs. He wouldn't go with her. He said, no, I'm not going to Kenya. So she called me at the last minute and said, Kira, this has always been your dream since we were little girls. You need to come with me. And I said, but I can't. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. I've got these kids. I have to stay here. She said, my mom overheard the conversation and she said, Kira, you're going. You need to go. This was your dream and you've got to go. I'll take care of the kids. Don't worry. Just go. So that is how I ended up going to Kenya the first time. And while I was there, I went and got a couple assignments for articles and, made sure that I was working when I arrived in Kenya and that I was actually doing something that was purposeful because I felt so guilty leaving. And yes, it was very difficult. And when I was in Kenya, I met someone and he, and we started a relationship, and he's the father of my third child. And that was another, connection that really brought me to Kenya. And it was a choice between him moving to America or me moving to Kenya. And there was never a question about it. And I really wanted my children to have that experience. So I was able to go, but we really had nothing. We had to start from scratch. I had to build everything from scratch up. And it was right at the beginning of the digital age in films. And you could buy a camera yourself and buy an edit bay in the first Adobe Premiere. And it enabled me to go and start hiring myself out for free and making, conservation films, wildlife films. And eventually I started, being hired to do it.
And of course, you've worked with, National Geographic, Discovery, the Africa Channel, BBC, and so many more. This is a wonderful portfolio, obviously, that you've built over time. But I'm wondering what those earliest films were and where you were able to place them.
So because I had to walk into a world that I didn't really know, and I really didn't even know how I was going to get started, but I was so determined, and I knew that I had to make it work. I basically went to a couple of the first conservation companies that I knew of. There were Daphne Sheldrick's Elephant Orphanage, which was not far away from where we were living, right on the Nairobi National Park. And I just basically offered myself up, and I said, I really think you need to have a short film that promotes what you do. And after much deliberation, she said, okay, you come. And I spent an entire year with these baby elephants once a week, filming them. And from that footage, I created a small promotional film for her. And I did the same with a couple other companies, Lewa Downs up north. Did the same, offered them the same thing. And at the time in Kenya, there really wasn't a lot of people in film. You were either coming from, London or BBC Bristol with these huge cameras, very expensive, and you were editing them abroad. There wasn't a very well developed film world inside of Kenya for wildlife. There was just a few amazing filmmakers like Alan Root and Simon Trevor, who were great heroes and mentors in many ways, who kind of paved their way, but they did it all themselves. So I modeled myself after them, and I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to have to do it all myself. I have to have my own cameras. I have to have my own editing bays. I needed to be able to edit, write, shoot, and get myself out into the bush with my own vehicle and my own camp and make my films. And that's what I progressed to. Little by little, I was able to do all of those things. And from there, start working with producers and partners in making films that air on National Geographic and BBC, etc.
Did you have any women role makers, inspiration, anyone that you were looking up to at that time, or indeed could work with in those early days? Who were the women in the industry that inspired you?
There weren't many, and there were just a few, but Angela Fisher and Carol Beckwith really are the ones that I have to, they've been the biggest mentors in my life. I was introduced to them, and they're the famous pair of photographers that have written, dozens of books and articles on African ceremonies. And I was very fortunate that we had a common friend, and he saw what I was doing on my own, remotely, and he knew them for many years, and he basically put us together and said, you all need each other. Angela and Carol, the work you're doing is so important, but you also need someone. You need a third wheel, which is a filmmaker, with you. And up until that point, they'd never wanted to have anyone along with them because they interfered too much with what they were doing. It takes a lot of, it's a very private journey, and you can't have a lot of outside people following you because you won't be invited into these ceremonies. You won't be accepted into groups of people if there's too many of you, and especially many cameras flying around. So we met, and they decided to like give me a trial shot. And it was me and my sound man, who was a family member in Kenya, my husband's younger brother at the time, and he and I still worked together. And we went along, and they expected it to be a complete disaster, and were really ready for it to be a miserable experience. But it turned out we had such a wonderful experience together, and we were very careful about not getting in each other's way. And we had so much fun that it became basically a 25-year-old. We've been working together now. We're 21 years totally. Recording ceremonies. And when you're recording a ceremony, it's not like you're showing up in the Masai Mara and, the Maasai are there and they dance for you. We were going into the remote regions of Africa where people don't go, and following ceremonies that sometimes take years to happen. And you have to make contacts. You have to be accepted. You have to be allowed in. And then basically recording them on stills and me on film. Ceremonies that probably many of them now won't happen again. And they especially have an amazing archive, and I have my film archive, which is also jointly with them as well. This is the work we've done together, and they are the women mentors in my life, completely. Intrepid explorers, two women that started in the 1970s, basically decided they were never going to get married and that this was their life, and they joined forces, and, they've achieved incredible things together.
Well, what a wonderful opportunity for you, especially given your ambitions.
It was. And it was also, I think, an important time to do the work we did and be out there in these places, which are now, of course, changing. So, we're still doing it. And the second film that I'm now working on is with them. And those are the two projects that I have going right now.
I know there'll be prospective filmmakers listening to this, Kire, and this all sounds like dreams are coming true for you almost daily with the work that you're doing and the opportunities that you have. But I'm sure they're wondering, well, how do you finance this? Because that's half the problem, isn't it? I mean, that's half the challenge, is financing these projects. But in the early days, it was all coming out of your own pocket, I would imagine, until you got the work, and then work begets the work, right? And the productions became bigger. But in those early days...
Absolutely. I've funded myself through a lot of what I do. And even now, when I believe in, the thing is I wanted to make the films that mattered to me. I didn't want to just be a filmmaker for hire. Not that I'm not for hire. I am, but I'm much more interested in doing my own work. In order to do that, you definitely have to be willing to take a chance financially. And I say all my money I put towards equipment. I saved my money and I used it to move forward and make the films I wanted to make. So, and then independently own my own footage. It didn't belong to someone else, and make those choices for myself. So yes, there was a lot of sacrifices involved. I wasn't walking around in, a beautiful wardrobe. I wasn't, having a lot of material things in my life, because I decided that I would rather use this money towards my passion, which is to make these films. So anyone that wants to do this, I would say that you have to be willing to put the time in, and you have to be willing to spend the days and hours and years it takes. But you also have to believe in what you're doing. And you need to also gain the skills that will allow you to do the job fully yourself. From the beginning of interning in California for news stations, I had to start with rolling cables, coiling cables, to pressing buttons on the VTR. I mean, I did every job there was. And all of those jobs that led me up to becoming a writer and then being allowed to shoot with the camera. And eventually I was in front of the camera and I was behind the camera. All of those things added up in the end, because those experience meant I could go out in the field on my own. I could bring my equipment with me. If something broke, we knew how to handle it. Financially, in Africa, especially at that time, it wasn't expensive to do a lot of these things, because you could, if you're living in the bush and you're bringing your own supplies with you, you're not spending a lot of money. You're working for yourself. It's like starting your own business. You have to just make sure that you're able to sustain yourself and your children and keep going, and then believing in it. And also, I think, having a bit of skill allows you to make things that people want. And then eventually you're paid for what you love to do.
When you look back then at what you've achieved, are there maybe a couple of milestones that come to mind that have enabled you to reach this point in your career?
I think that there were some milestones along the way when I remember when I was still modeling, and there were certain people, like my first husband, who basically said to me, "Stop trying. Don't be a model. Don't do that. It's such a short career. Use your head. Do something else with your life, and build something else." And those were the moments that pivoted my attention away from feeling like I needed to be a model and continue modeling to deciding, no, I'm going to go towards what I always wanted. My mother being supportive and behind me the whole time. And also the trip that I was invited to join with my dear friend Snowden to go to Africa. These are all the little moments, the chances that happen in life that allow you to go to the next step. And then you have to step out on your own into the dark and basically take that journey yourself and be willing to do it without a safety net. And I think that's where, if you truly want something, you're willing to do that.
You've mentioned the sacrifices, obviously, along the way. You also mentioned the guilt that you've experienced by having to be a single mother most of the time and pursuing your dreams, your goals as a filmmaker. Tell us a little bit more about the children now and what they've grown up to become and what they learned from their mum.
Absolutely. I was the person who spent 50% of my time with my children, the other 50% of the time working. Always near them, though. I never left them. We were always together. I always felt a little bit guilty because I wasn't the mother that went to the PTA meetings and, baked cookies and did craft projects with my kids. Instead, I was the mother that they would come look over my shoulder and say, "What are you doing?" And, I would explain to them what I was making, and I'd bring them on the shoots, and they would hand them a camera and encourage them to always be with me. But I did always feel that there was a feeling of that I had to choose a bit. I couldn't just be 100% the mother with the father at home. It wasn't a traditional setup at all. It was very unconventional, our lives. And we did live very unconventional lives, but we did spend our nights together, and we did read Harry Potter under candlelight, and we did spend many good hours together. But then I was very focused on what I was doing. So they had a lot of freedom too to kind of decide what they wanted to do. And interestingly enough, they've all basically found their way into what they love. And I think the good side of it was I was able to model a certain strength that they've been able, they saw it, so they can copy that themselves. They have no doubt in themselves. All my children are self-starters. They're all, they've all started their own businesses, except for my youngest, because he's so young and he's just now launching himself into the world. But he knows that's what he wants to do. And they've all gone into the creative arts. My daughter is an amazing photographer, and she works as a full-time commercial photographer in Colorado and makes a really good living doing it. And on the side, she's a knitter, and she knits amazing, beautiful things. And she's also an artist. My son, my eldest son, is also a filmmaker, and he's lived all over the world. And he lives in Bangkok, Thailand, where he toggles between his film work and his own projects that he also does with his sister, and the cryptocurrency world, so he's become very dynamic in his way. And my youngest son, who grew up with me on safari, living in tents and running wild barefoot herding cattle with the Maasai and the Pokot and Rendili, he grew up in a world of freedom and Africa and the bush and warriors and spears and adventure. And he's decided that he wanted to be a full-time soldier himself before he moves on to something else. So he's now in the military. And I do think once he comes out of that stage that he'll go into having his own business. So they've all become independent. I think there were things that they wish that they'd had, probably more family holidays and traditional, conventional things that we didn't live. But, there you have it. I mean, you take these choices, and there's always this, you come to this joint in the road, and there's two choices, and which path are you going to go down? And once you've made your choice, you can look back and say, yeah, but what if? But you can't keep doing that. You have to move forward, because life is about choices, and every choice leads you to something else.
It sounds as if you are now in your early 60s in a place where you really want to be, doing what you want to do and making the films, telling the stories that you really care about.
That's right.
Are you in the best place you've been in your life now, Kire?
Absolutely. Now I feel that, my role as a parent has been fulfilled in the sense of raising your children and launching them on solid ground and feeling like, they're really whole and happy people. And once you've kind of gotten to that point, I can now, for the first time since I was 19, I'm able to focus fully on myself. And it's a bit of a crazy feeling, because I have never had that as an adult. So it's exciting, because it means all my attention now, besides my your family's always important in your life, and you spend as much time with them as you can. But now my time really can be focused on the films that I really want to make. And that's what I'll be doing. In the next 20 years of my life, I will be doing the work that I feel makes the biggest impact and can make the biggest difference. And most of that's around conservation.
Well, that brings us very nicely to the two productions that you're currently involved in. So let's start with Tolstoy, The Tomato Thief, because he's magnificent, and I can't wait to see this documentary that you're making about him. Tell us what to expect and where that will be distributed.
Okay, I can summarize it. Tolstoy, as we know, is a super tusker elephant in Kenya. And super tuskers are very rare in today's world. Super tusker is a male or female, but mostly male, that has ivory that's 100 pounds per side. And in the case of a that's a tusker. Super tusker is when the ivory actually touches the ground. There are only a handful of them left in the world. No one knows exactly how many, because there are always a few coming through and growing up, but at least 24. And that's not much. So he's very special and unique in that way. The story is about a super tusker elephant and a little boy of 12 years old who hates him. It takes place in Kenya at the base of Mount Kilimanjaro, where some of the world's last super tusker elephants live. And a new generation of Maasai children are growing up as a first generation of farmers. Traditionally, the Maasai are pastoralist, nomadic people or semi-nomadic people who live on their cattle. And because of changes in their own community and in the government, they are now settling on their land and being given their own pieces of land, which means they have to leave the pastoralist lifestyle, which is really the reason why most of these areas are still open rangelands without fences. And because of that, they're fencing in their little areas and they're learning how to subside in other ways, which is now gone to subsistence farming. So here we have this noble group of people, the Maasai, turning to farming, and this first generation of children growing up as farm children, not as cattle herders, even though they still have their small, groups of cattle. They're going to schools, farming, and now what's happening is that the elephants, all this land, which was their land too, and they could roam freely on before, is being subdivided, and they're being pushed out of areas where they've always gone to eat and forage. And so they're continuing to follow their ancient paths through this landscape, which is now encroaching on farms along the way. And what they're finding are crops. And the most popular crop is tomatoes. And of course, they're falling in love with tomatoes and becoming addicted to them. So these children growing up with these elephants raiding their farms at night, demolishing their entire crop, and leaving their family with nothing to eat and nothing to sell to pay for their school fees. And they basically hate these elephants. They're the monsters under their beds. And they're a generation of them growing up with wildlife and despising elephants. And then you have the elephant side of the story where their landscape has been changed by humans in the last 15 years, and they don't understand what's going on. So that's Tolstoy's side of the story. And they don't want to give up eating crops because quite frankly, they're delicious. And so it's a new war that has broken out between people and human-wildlife conflict is what it is. And this is a story about human-wildlife conflict and this iconic animal and this amazing little boy and this journey that they take together.
What a magnificent story. Where will we see this air, Kira?
The film is an independent film. I'm making with my partners out of Los Angeles, so Diamond Dogs and Flat Out Films, and we've been privately funded. So we're not. We want to hold on to the story as long as we can before we release it and sell it, because we want to keep it as authentic and pure as possible. There's a great message that comes with the film, and it's urgent. And we don't want to sell out too soon. So the film will be ready for 2025. And we'll be obviously launching it in film festivals and then deciding on, even before then, where we're going to end up placing it. But I imagine it will be on one of the main streaming networks and also theater releases.
Right. Well, very much look forward to that. But also tell us about the second project you're working on. You have two in production right now.
Yeah, and I'm actually working on that right now. And that film is on the Maasai people, which is the same group of that's in Tolstoy, but in a different area. And it's their Enoto ceremony, which is the largest ceremony for the Maasai and one of the last remaining important ceremonies traditionally in Africa. It's the warrior ceremony where the warriors are turned into, as they put it, old men, actually junior elders. And it's an iconic ceremony that takes place over 5 to 10 days, depending on which part of Maasai land you're in, that brings in hundreds of warriors, and they build a specific manyatta, which is a kind of a cattle corral with small huts inside that hosts the ceremony. And they go through ritual after ritual until their final ritual, where their mothers shave off their beautiful long warrior hair. And it's the most dreaded ceremony of the Maasai, because every young man who's a warrior dreads the day when their warriorhood ends. But it's really about the system of the Maasai and how amazing it is with this ancient culture is able to maintain their traditions and how it works for them, because they basically now it's every 6 years, but every 15 years in the past, the elders replace themselves with a new generation. And it's a bit like a garden. They plant the seeds for a new generation to grow, and they teach them their values of their culture, which is all around respect, community, and brotherhood. And this then germinates, and they then will be the ones that will plant the next generation as they go up in their life to the next stages. So it's a beautiful ceremony that we can all learn a lot from, with a lot of wisdom in it. And it's never been covered before completely. And we were invited to cover it. And I'm working on this with Angela Fisher and Carol Beckwith. They're doing the stills, plus they have an archive of 50 years of Maasai Enotos that will be part of the film. And it's a one-of-a-kind film that probably will never happen again, because Enotos are changing so quickly with school and modernization and government pressures, that, we don't know how many more there will be and how they will look and how they will feel. So we're trying to create a record for the world and for the Maasai, that will hold their cultural messages and for future generations.
Well, given how important this work is, the authenticity of it, and how it seems to be defining you as a filmmaker, Kire, I'm wondering what your legacy would be. What would you like it to be when you complete all this work and more to come?
I think what I would like it to be is that people will have this work for future generations that will be able to immerse themselves into a world that's almost as alien as another planet to our modern world today, and feel, sense in every way the value and the beauty that exists in human beings. And, the thing that drives me forward is there's always two words that I kind of try to follow. And one is truth and the other is beauty. Because I find that, the most beautiful things are the most authentic things and the most truthful things. And I'm just, I feel very fortunate to be the carrier of the message. And if I can relay the message to others, that's really what that's the impact I want to make in my lifetime. And that this body of work that I've been doing for the last 25 years will have its place in future generations, whether it's in museums, schools, or online, that, people can look up any part of the work I've done and be able to immerse themselves in it and experience what I've experienced and feel it fully, and, walk away with some added value.
And hopefully inspire other filmmakers too to continue to make these invaluable contributions in so many ways, Kire. I know how busy you are, so I really, really appreciate you spending an hour with me and sharing your story. And I want to wish you the very best of luck with all these productions and more to come. And we will put a link in the show notes to your website so our listeners can follow you and go and watch these beautiful documentaries. Kire, thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.
My thanks again to Kire and to you for listening. And don't forget to check out the show notes for links to Kire's website and to Tolstoy, the Tomato Thief website too. And there'll also be a link to follow Kira on social media too. And if you're on Instagram, do give us a follow at The Art Podcast. Of course, that's art with 2 A's. Don't forget to leave your comments, questions, or suggestions there. Always love to get your comments and any ideas you have for guests. We always love to hear from you. And if you've been following us since we started the show last year, you'll know that we have reached our first anniversary. April the 1st, 2023 was when we launched the show. And thanks to you, the listeners, we are still here after, 40 episodes in season 1 and now 14 in season 2 with lots more to come. So my thanks to you, as always, for supporting the show. I'll be back next week with another woman from around the world of visual arts, so I do hope you'll join me then.